Now that we're acquainted with our minifigure, let's create a small exercise that will show us the importance of a very basic concept in fracturing, the name attribute. So let's create an empty geometry node. Let's rename it minifigure. And let's dive into the node. I will press tab and start typing Dan minifigure and press enter to create a minifigure node. Although this volume will not focus on rigid body dynamic simulations, I will create a very simple setup that will let us test how this geometry reacts to some forces and some collisions. So I will go back to the object context and I will look for my rigid bodies toolbar, and with my geometry selected, I'm going to click on RBD fractured object. Now, whenever you get this prompt, I recommend that you always use RBD packed object, which is a newer way of simulating and a more efficient way to do it. So I will click here on RBD packed object, and 2 new nodes will be generated, or actually 1 new node, the AutoDOP networks, and inside my minifigure node there are 3 new nodes created: the REST node, the setup packed primitives, and the DOP import node that will fetch the simulated geometry back into the geometry node. So for now, let's not worry about how the rigid body dynamic simulation works. We will see this in detail in volume 2. For now, let's just go back to the object context and see how the simulation is working. So I'm going to play the animation. So for now, the minifigure just falls into infinity. And we can see there's some gravity, so that's fine. The thing is, I don't want him to fall indefinitely. So I'll go now to the collisions toolbar and create a ground plane. So you can control click on the ground plane icon and it will automatically be set to the AutoDOP network. Now let's click play and notice how now all the pieces of the character are falling independently, almost as if the character was completely unglued or as if the pieces were not attached to each other. So let's try to fix this. First of all, let me move the character up and probably rotate it a bit just to get a more interesting result. Again, let's play the animation. Okay, so here we have again all the pieces are breaking apart. Now let's dive back into the minifigure node and again let's see what's happening here. So I have my geometry, then the rest node, and then the assemble node, which is packing the geometry to prepare the geometry to be simulated in the rigid body dynamics. But notice how this create name attribute is on. So for now, let's turn this attribute off and resimulate to see what happens. I'm going to click here on the real-time toggle just to see the animation in real time and press play. So notice how now the pieces are not breaking apart. Again, if we were to turn on the create name attribute, the pieces would break apart. So let's open the geometry spreadsheet to see what's happening under the hood. And you'll notice how this assemble node is adding the name attribute to every single point of the packed primitives. And the rigid body simulation is using each individual piece as a different object in the simulation. Now, a very important thing to consider is that although these are point attributes, we could override these attributes here on our geometry on the primitive level. That way we can define which pieces will break apart and which pieces will remain together. So let's do that now. I'm going to go back to my scene view, and before the geometry is packed here, when we create the geometry, I will add the name attribute manually. So I will rewind the animation, and this is something that can be done in several ways. The way I prefer is through an attribute wrangler. So I will press tab and type attribute wrangler, press enter, and I will connect the node just below my geometry. Click here on the display render, and I will change the color of the node. So I'll press C and select this purple color and press C again to hide the swatches. Another thing that I will do is change the name to set group 0. So a very important thing, as we mentioned earlier, is that the name attribute should be added to the primitives, not to the points. So I will change this run over option to primitives, and I will type the following code: s at name, which is the name of the attribute, and I'm typing s before the at sign because the name attribute is a string, or in other words, text. And now to define a value, I need to type equals, open quotes, and type the name I want to add, or the value that the name attribute will have. In this case, I can call it piece 0, close quotes, close parentheses, and I will type semicolon to finish the line of code. And to evaluate, I will press Control Enter. And actually, I don't need this parentheses. I will re-evaluate the code, and now it's working. So let's click here on the information icon and notice how the primitives now have a name attribute. And if we open the geometry spreadsheet and click here on the primitives component, you will note how all the pieces now are named piece 0 because the wrangler is operating on all of the primitives on the geometry. So let's see what happens now if I resimulate my geometry. So I will rewind, back up a little bit, and press play. So here we're back on square one. The thing is that if you select the assemble node, first of all, we forgot to turn off the create name attribute. Since we are now assigning the attributes manually, we can turn off the create name attribute in the assemble node. But most importantly, if you scroll down to where the transfer attribute is, we need to transfer the name attributes from the incoming geometry. So let's play the animation again. And since we only have one single piece name, which is piece 0, the entire object will be treated as a single piece within the simulation. So let's try this. I will add a few different name pieces and let's see if we are able to detach certain parts of the character in a more controlled way. So first of all, let's change the name from set group to set piece, because we're not creating groups, we're creating a name attribute called piece. And let's copy this node by pressing Ctrl C and then paste it with Ctrl V. And let's connect it here on the main tree. And let's change the name of this attribute to piece1. And I will select a specific group. So remember that the minifigure comes pre-configured with several groups. So I will click here on the group drop down, and let's select the helmet, for example, or the visor. And now the visor has the name attribute piece1. The rest of the pieces are called piece 0. So again, let's simulate. And now the visor is breaking apart, and the rest of the figure remains as a single piece. So in this way, you could create any combination of pieces that your shot requires. Let's try adding a few more pieces before we continue. So again, I will copy the attribute Wrangler, paste it. I will change the name to piece 2 and change the group to, let's say, the left arm. And let's also add the left hand. Finally, let's make another piece. So I will copy again, paste, change the name to piece 3. And this time let's select, say, the backpack and simulate. Now, by just manually adding the piece attribute to the pieces that we want to break apart, we can have great control of how the simulation will react. And this will be very important when directing your destruction effects.